A struggling single mother working as a waitress unknowingly serves a wealthy man. Her estranged billionaire father who abandoned her years ago. But when he recognizes her, his shocking confession changes everything, leading to an emotional and dramatic confrontation. Welcome to our video. Today, we have a story that will touch your heart and keep you on the edge of your seat. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. If you enjoy heartwarming and suspenseful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Claire's alarm buzzed sharply at 5 a.m., a sound she had grown to resent but couldn't afford to ignore. Her tiny one-bedroom apartment felt colder than usual, and she sighed as she pulled herself out of bed. Across the room, her 8-year-old son, Ethan, slept peacefully, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. Claire tiptoed to the kitchenette, brewed a cup of coffee, and took a moment to gather her thoughts. Life as a single mother had never been easy, and working long hours at the diner barely kept the bills paid. She often wondered how she had managed to juggle it all, being a mother, a provider, and a dreamer who had no time left to chase dreams. By the time Ethan woke up, Claire had prepared his lunch and packed his school bag. "Good morning, buddy," she said, ruffling his messy hair. "Morning, Mom. Are you working late again tonight?" Ethan asked, his big blue eyes filled with concern. Claire's heart sank. "Just a little late, sweetheart. But I promise I'll check on you before you go to bed." At the diner, the usual chaos greeted Claire. The clinking of plates, the buzz of conversations, and the ever-present smell of coffee and bacon. Her co-workers waved half-heartedly, already swamped with orders. Claire tied her apron and got to work. Around noon, the diner door swung open, and a man in an expensive suit walked in. He looked out of place, his polished shoes and sharp features contrasting with the humble surroundings. Claire felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity as she greeted him. "Table for one?" she asked, forcing a polite smile. "Yes, please." "Anywhere quiet," he replied, his deep voice resonating with a warmth that unsettled her. Claire served him his meal, her usual smile wavering as the man studied her intently. When he left, she found a $100 tip on the table with a note. "You remind me of someone I once knew." Her heart raced. Who was this man? And why did his gaze feel so familiar? That night, Ethan's innocent question struck a nerve. "Mom, who's Grandpa? Do I have one?" Claire didn't have an answer, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the man had left behind. Claire couldn't shake the strange feeling from the diner. The man's piercing gaze and the note he left had stuck with her all night. Who was he, and why did his presence feel so unsettlingly familiar? The next morning, as she packed Ethan's lunch, her thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious customer. "Mom, are you okay?" Ethan's voice snapped her out of her daze. "Yeah, buddy, just thinking about work," she replied, forcing a smile. The diner buzzed with its usual hum when Claire arrived. Orders came in one after another, and she welcomed the busyness. It kept her mind off the nagging questions from the night before. But her reprieve didn't last long. Around noon, the doorbell chimed, and Claire froze as the same man walked in again. This time, his confident stride and expensive suit didn't surprise her, but his choice to sit in her section did. She reluctantly approached his table, unsure of what to say. "Welcome back. Coffee?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Please," he said with a small smile, his eyes scanning her face as though searching for something. As she served him, he struck up a conversation. "You work here often?" Claire nodded, keeping her answers short. "It pays the bills." He asked her questions, harmless on the surface but uncomfortably personal. Where did she grow up? Did she have family nearby? Claire's stomach twisted as his words touched on topics she preferred to leave buried. Then, as she turned to leave his table, he said something that made her freeze. "Your mother's name was Linda, wasn't it?" Her heart skipped a beat. How did he know that? She spun around, her eyes wide with confusion. The man smiled faintly. "We really should talk, Claire." Claire's breath caught in her throat as the man's words echoed in her mind. "Your mother's name was Linda, wasn't it?" How could a stranger know something so personal? Her hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the coffee pot she was holding. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp, her emotions swirling between confusion and anger. The man looked at her with calm but sad eyes. Please, just sit down for a moment. I'll explain everything. Claire hesitated. The diner was busy and customers needed her. But the weight of his words made her chest tighten. Against her better judgment, she slid into the booth across from him, crossing her arms defensively. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. The man exhaled slowly, his face clouded with guilt. "My name is Richard, and I'm your father." The words felt like a slap. Claire's heart pounded, and her world tilted as the man she had barely noticed just days ago dropped a bombshell she wasn't prepared for. "No," she said flatly, shaking her head. "My father left us years ago. He abandoned us. You can't possibly be him." "I didn't abandon you," Richard said softly, his voice tinged with regret. "I had to leave. There were reasons, things I couldn't explain then. But I never stopped thinking about you or your mother." Claire laughed bitterly. "Thinking about us? Is that supposed to make up for the years of pain? The nights I cried myself to sleep wondering why you left?" Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was old and creased, but Claire immediately recognized the image. It was a picture of her as a child, smiling brightly. "I've carried this with me every day," he said quietly. Claire's anger faltered, but she wasn't ready to forgive. "Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I'm running out of time," he replied. Claire sat in stunned silence, the weight of Richard's words sinking in. Her mind raced, grappling with the truth she didn't want to accept. Her father, the man who had disappeared from her life when she was just a teenager, leaving her and her mother to fend for themselves. She had built up walls, convincing herself that she didn't need him, that she was better off without him. Yet here he was, sitting across from her, claiming to be the father she had long since stopped expecting. "Why now?" Claire repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why after all these years?" Richard looked down, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of his coffee cup. "I've spent the last decade regretting the choice I made. Leaving you and your mother. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But it wasn't just about abandoning you. I was forced to leave because of circumstances beyond my control. Things that were out of my hands." Claire's heart thudded painfully in her chest. What kind of circumstances could justify leaving your family? "We needed you." Her voice cracked as the anger she had buried for so long surged to the surface. "I was involved in a business deal that went wrong," Richard continued, his voice strained with guilt. "I made enemies, dangerous ones. It wasn't safe for you or your mother to be around me anymore. I had to disappear for your protection. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought if I stayed away, I could keep you both safe." Claire's mind reeled. She had grown up with no idea of the truth. All these years, she had believed that he simply didn't care, that he didn't love her or her mother. And now, to hear him claim it was all for their safety, for their protection, felt like a punch in the gut. "So all this time, you were watching from afar?" Claire asked, disbelief clouding her voice. Richard's eyes filled with sorrow. "I never stopped watching, but I couldn't reach out. Not until now." The silence between them grew heavy. Claire's mind was spinning, struggling to process the reality of the situation. Her father had been watching her. For all these years, while she worked herself to the bone to provide for Ethan, Richard had been somewhere out there, keeping tabs on her life from a distance. It felt like betrayal, but the raw emotion in his eyes, sorrow, regret, and guilt, left her questioning everything she had ever believed about him. "I don't know what to say," Claire murmured, her hands shaking. "You've missed so much. You've missed me, you've missed Ethan growing up, you've missed everything." Richard nodded, his face pale. "I know. I can't undo the past. I can't change the fact that I wasn't there when you needed me most. But I'm here now, Claire, and I want to make things right." Her heart ached at his words, but doubt clouded her thoughts. Could she trust him again? Could she believe that after all this time, he truly wanted to be part of her life? "What do you mean, make things right?" she asked, her voice tight. "What does that even look like after everything?" Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table between them. Claire eyed it suspiciously, her instincts telling her to be cautious. "I've been working on something for you and Ethan. I don't expect forgiveness right away, but I want to offer you something. A way to make up for the years I lost." She glanced at the folder, curiosity bubbling up despite her reservations. Richard's eyes were fixed on her, his gaze pleading for her to understand. "Claire, this is important," he said softly. "I've made arrangements to ensure you and Ethan are taken care of. No more struggle, no more worrying about bills, no more living paycheck to paycheck. I want to change your life. But there's more, much more." Her breath hitched as she reached for the folder, the sense of unease mixing with a faint spark of hope. But before she could open it, the door to the diner creaked, and a voice from behind startled her. "Claire, what are you doing with him?" Claire turned sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the doorway was Ethan, his small face scrunched in confusion and concern. His eyes darted from Claire to Richard, the man she had just met again after all these years. The tension in the air was palpable, and Claire's stomach churned with worry. She hadn't prepared Ethan for this. She hadn't even had time to process it herself. "Mom, who is this?" Ethan asked, his voice small but demanding. Claire's mind raced. How was she supposed to explain this? The last thing she wanted was for Ethan to get caught in the middle of this tangled mess. She stood up quickly, her hands instinctively reaching for him. "Ethan, honey, it's a long story," Claire began, trying to keep her voice steady, though her heart was beating in overdrive. "This is, Richard. He's an old friend of mine. I'll explain everything later, okay?" Ethan eyed Richard warily, his young mind trying to make sense of the situation. Claire could see the confusion on his face, but there was something else too, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Richard stood up slowly, a solemn expression crossing his face. "I understand, Claire. This isn't the time. But I need to tell you, Ethan, that I'm not just a friend. I'm your grandfather." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and for a moment, the diner felt completely still. Ethan blinked, as if processing the weight of the statement, before he turned to Claire. "Grandfather?" he asked, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief in his voice. Claire's stomach turned. She had no idea how to explain this. How to make Ethan understand the man standing before him wasn't the hero she had imagined growing up. But just as she was about to respond, the door to the diner burst open again, and a tall figure walked in. The newcomer's footsteps echoed through the diner, pulling everyone's attention. Claire's heart sank when she saw who it was. The man who had entered was tall, well-dressed, and had a commanding presence. Definitely someone important. But what struck Claire the most was the look of recognition in Richard's eyes, followed by a flash of guilt. "Richard," the man said, his voice cold but calm. "I thought you'd be here. I warned you to stay away." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Who was this man? The tension in the air thickened, and she could feel her pulse racing. Ethan looked up at Claire with wide eyes, confusion written all over his face. "Mom? What's going on?" Richard stood up quickly, his expression turning defensive. "Stay out of this, Jason," he said sharply. Jason smiled, a cruel twist on his lips. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Richard. It's already too late." He turned to Claire, his gaze calculating. "You don't know the whole story, do you?" Claire's stomach twisted in dread. What was going on? Why was this stranger involved? She wanted to demand answers, but her thoughts were spinning, and she needed to protect Ethan, who was looking more frightened by the minute. "Jason, please," Richard said, his voice now low and filled with urgency. "You don't have to do this." Jason's smile faded, replaced with a hardened expression. "I warned you about the consequences. You think you can just waltz back into their lives after all these years, offering them nothing but your empty promises." The air grew thick with tension, and just as Claire was about to speak, Richard suddenly grabbed her arm, his grip tight and frantic. "Run, Claire. Get Ethan out of here. Now." Before she could react, Jason stepped forward, blocking the door. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she looked from Richard to Jason. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her shoulders, and she could feel Ethan's small hand grip hers tightly, his fear evident in his wide eyes. She had never imagined that the simple act of reconnecting with her estranged father would lead to this, a confrontation that threatened to unravel everything she had worked so hard to build. "Please," Richard whispered urgently, his voice shaky with desperation. "Just go. I'll explain everything later. Just get out of here, Claire. For Ethan's sake." Claire hesitated. She wanted to stay, to demand answers from both of these men, but something in Richard's eyes told her there was more at stake here, something bigger than she had ever known. Her protective instincts kicked in, and without another word, she turned to Ethan, pulling him close to her side. "Come on, Ethan," she said gently, her voice shaking with emotion. "We're going." But as Claire took a step toward the door, Jason moved to block her way once more, his expression cold and unyielding. "Leaving so soon?" Jason asked, his voice laced with venom. "You think it's that easy? This isn't over, Richard. You've made a choice, and you'll regret it." Richard stood firm, his eyes locked on Jason, a silent battle playing out between them. "You've won," Richard said quietly, his voice full of resignation. "But not today. This isn't the end." Claire's heart raced as the tension between the two men seemed to boil over. In the blink of an eye, Richard made a choice that would change everything. He stepped between Claire and Jason, his body blocking her path. "Go, Claire," he said with finality. "Get out while you still can." With one last glance at the two men, Claire grabbed Ethan's hand and ran, the world around her blurring in her haste. As she stepped outside, the cold air hitting her face, she realized that her life would never be the same again. She didn't know what the future held or what the consequences of today's events would be. But one thing was certain. No matter how messy the past was, she was ready to face whatever came next, together with Ethan. As Claire and Ethan walked away from the diner, her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and relief. The echoes of the confrontation with Richard and Jason still rang in her ears. But now there was a quiet, steady resolve within her. She had made it out. She had protected Ethan. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, Claire felt a spark of hope flicker within her. She looked down at Ethan, whose innocent eyes were filled with questions, and her heart broke a little. He deserved answers, but not right now, not while the world still felt like it was spinning out of control. "Mom, what happened in there?" Ethan asked softly, his voice laced with uncertainty. Claire knelt down to his level, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "I know you're confused, sweetheart. And I promise, I'll explain everything when the time is right. But for now, all you need to know is that I'll always protect you. No matter what." Ethan nodded, the trust in his eyes unwavering. She had always promised him a better life, a life free from the mistakes of the past. And now, as they walked away from the shadows of old betrayals, Claire knew that the only way forward was to build a future based on love, resilience, and the strength of their bond. With a final glance back at the diner, Claire held Ethan's hand firmly, as if drawing courage from him. No matter what secrets Richard and Jason held, they couldn't touch her now. She had made it through the hardest part, the choice to move forward. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the city. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt the weight of the past lift off her shoulders. As they walked into the night, a new chapter of their story began. One that was theirs alone, full of possibilities, second chances, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.